Hey guys, what is up? It is Philbo, and we are looking at one of the strongest hitting builds in the game right now, and that is Fierce Strike and Thorn Explosion. Fierce Strike is going to be our primary ability, which is melee. It dominated top list in Season 2 and probably will continue to do so in Season 3. And Thorn Explosion, the new skill, is doing more damage than any other skill in the entire game, so the two go together quite well if you're looking for massive damage. Now, the area of effect of this build is not the greatest, so I wouldn't recommend this as your primary build for farming low level dungeons, but if you're pushing higher level dungeons, this one will do quite well. And another thing about this build is that we are not going to be keeping it physical. We are going to convert this to, and you will have two choices, either lightning or cold damage. I'm going with converting to lightning damage. And the reason we are going to convert to element damage is because element damage scales very well. And also, when you convert to element, you have the potential to get 3 shared blessing effects. So cast Thor for the element damage amp. You can also pick up Acubin for the lightning damage amplification, which will be shared between the two since we're converting both our skills to lightning. And then we have Alyssa, which has the area damage amplification, which both of our skills have the area tag. So that's why we're converting. But let's go ahead and give an overview of the skills. We have Fierce Strike. With Fierce Strike, we are going to summon a hammer and deal damage. Straightforward enough. We're going to have, by default, a base speed dampening of 5%, so it's going to be a little bit slower than your normal skill. Has a small area of effect, and you get a critical damage bonus based off what type of weapon you use, so I recommend two-handed weapon to get the 100% critical damage. We also have this 45 crowd control rate. This is going to translate to roughly 18% crowd control for freeze and for bind, which is the cold and the lightning crowd controls. And we're going to be able to crowd control with this build both freeze and bind. I'll explain how later. That's why I said you can convert this build to either lightning or cold. It doesn't matter. Moving on, we have that we can trigger the ultimate blow every 2.5 seconds. So every 2.5 seconds, we'll get this ultimate blow, which has a larger area of effect, a big damage multiplier, amplification, then also additional critical damage and critical rate. We see that we get bigger area of effect, area damage, and area damage amp when we move to the legendary. For awakenings, we are going to awaken to origin to get the melee damage amplification and, more importantly, the melee tag. Doing this will allow us to use some of the best link runes in the game, like Grand Approach, which requires melee tag, and then also Fighting Spirit, and we'll go over those in a little bit. For Thorn Explosion, you place the Thorn Explosion down, it hits a few times, and then a big thorn will come out of the ground and hit. So there is a bleed chance on this, but since we're converting, this will go away, but don't worry about that. The bleed gives kind of an insignificant amount of damage. There are 2 thorn attacks that occur. The first one has small thorns that come out of the ground and hit every 0.3 seconds for a small amount. Then the second thorn attack will happen, which is the large thorn that comes out of the ground and hits for a large amount. And it is more than the 3 thorns from the first attack combined for. So that is Thorn Explosion. For the Awakening, we're going to go with Source because there are 2 damage amplifications that you get from it. So it's actually kind of insane how much damage amp you can get from this. So up to 25 plus 25 more. So you're hoping to get like a 20 plus and a 20 plus. If you can get that, that's a really good Awakening. But this is the one to get. The other 2 just don't compare. Moving on, we're going to use for our attack enhance release element for the element damage amplification. For defense enhance, I use Tenacious Regeneration to get health recovery and health regen. The movement skill I like the most is Roll because it has a low cooldown. And then I optionally use Penetrating Slash, but you don't have to use 2 movement skills. I just like to because I like getting around quickly. Then finally, I'm using the Seal of Critical Chance because I'm not crit capped. So if you're not crit capped at 100%, then this is the best one. Otherwise, I'd use Seal of Condensed Elements. Okay, let's go ahead and talk about the links. The links that I'm using are Quick Attack to get my attack speed up on Fierce Strike, Convert Lightning Damage because we're converting to Lightning. Then we are using Fighting Spirit to get Strike Damage Amplification. Then we can also get up to 30 stacks of Fighting Spirit, which will give us a big damage dampening for physical and a little bit less for element damage. So 30% here and 15% here on the element damage. So very defensive. Such a nice link rune to have and I highly recommend using it. And then also Grand Approach, which allows you to do really, really big damage when you get close to the enemy. So at 100 distance or less, you will get the full 45% damage amplification, and then you'll get another 5% here. And then we'll also regenerate 3% plus 1% max HP per second. This 1% is based on whether or not you're 200 distance or less. So that's why I love this one. Big damage and big defense at the same time. Finally, I have the melee damage amplification rune on. However, if you're looking for more damage, you could put the concentrated area damage rune on, which gives bigger damage amplification, but it dampens the area of effect a little bit. So if you're going for max damage, that's the one you want to do. And some other runes I could recommend would be like area of effect if you're looking to make this larger. If you're farming, you probably need to use the area effect rune. So you could throw that one on. And then also, I like find weakness if you're not crit capped. This is a good option if you don't have some of the other runes, like Grand Approach, which is a rare synthesis rune. You could put the find weakness rune on here to get your crit up closer to crit cap. And both of these runes, the area effect and find weakness, would apply to Thorn Explosion as well. One more thing I want to say is that instead of using quick attack, you could use focus strike if your attack speed is closer to attack speed cap. It gives less attack speed on the first and second strike and adds a lot of area damage. And then on the third strike gives a big area damage amplification, but it also adds this area of effect, which is really, really nice to have. It's another rune that can add a area of effect. And then everybody basically awakens this to give the area damage amp on first and second strike. So this is an option here as well. Then we will spell activate on attack hit our Thorn Explosion, add Mana Storm for big damage amplification, albeit at a resource cost increase. Strike, which is another really large strike damage amplification rune, and the attack speed dampening and cast speed dampening don't matter because this is the activated rune. Concentrated area damage again for big damage. Concentrated area damage for big damage amplification at an area of effect dampening downside. And if you're farming, you could take this off and put area effect on if you want to farm with this build. Again, I don't recommend that, but if you only want to play with one build, that's how you would do it. We're converting to lightning damage, and then I'm using lightning penetration right now. This one has been doing more damage for me than the element damage amplification rune, so this is the one I'm running with. So the stats that we are going to need will be 200 to dexterity, 200 or the minimum you need for release element or into intelligence, and then the rest into strength. The reason we want 200 here and at least 200 in intelligence as well is because in Maggot, we are going to want to pick up this 40% damage node if we have 200 or more of strength, dex, and int. And then we are also going to come down and grab this right here, this area damage, and also the projectile damage. The reason we're picking up projectile damage and not going this route and grabbing melee damage is because Thorn Explosion actually does more damage in this build than Fierce Strike. Thorn Explosion has the projectile tag, so this one makes more sense for us to grab. And for the Zodiac, I won't go through each of these. You should primarily focus on things like damage upon attack and not damage upon spell. You don't want damage upon spell for this build. You want damage upon attack because this is an attack-based build with Fierce Strike, so make sure you're doing that. If you need additional mana, things like in Unos, you can pick up some additional mana recovery, and even here in Tree 7, you can pick that up as well. And then this one right here in Scent, I think this is good right here, this area of effect. And then also in Farmer, pick up this additional HP nodes. These are really nice. So those are things I would point out. And so for the specialization in this build, usually with melee builds, I go into Hammer, but in this one, I think it makes a lot of sense for us to go into Brilliance, and I'll explain why once we get to the third specialization tree. But let's start off with specialization 1. We are going to go down this route and grab this 6% strike damage amplification. We also get overpower and acceleration. And then I know that this is not a cast speed build. This is an attack speed build, but I am grabbing this node right here currently to get the resource cost dampening. 8% is a lot of resource cost or mana cost dampening, and so I'm taking it. If mana is not an issue for you, you could drop these two and pick up element penetration. So that is specialization 1. For specialization 2, what I'm doing is I am going up here, grabbing this damage amplification here. I'm also grabbing sharpness to get critical rate, critical damage. And then again, I know this isn't cast speed and this is not going to help us at all. But at least in knowledge, we do get damage upon spell, 50%. This is going to help out our Thorn explosion, and then get us this really nice juicy node here for 15% damage amplification. Don't worry, even though these are dead stats, this is still the best specialization, trust me. And then finally, this is kind of like the reason we really, really want to take this tree, is so that we can go into Pirate. Now, we are going to grab this 15 element damage amplification, and I'm going all the way up here and grabbing this additional cold damage equal to 10% of damage on every hit. This is why I've converted to lightning. If you convert to cold instead, what you would do is this. You would go down here and grab these points instead to get the additional lightning damage. You want the opposite element. So if you're converting to cold, you grab these points. If you're converting to lightning, you grab the points on top. And I'll explain why. We are grabbing these points because this node right here, even though we aren't doing cold damage in our build, 10% additional damage will be applied as cold damage. So we're going to be doing lightning damage and then an extra 10% damage as cold damage. It will hit as cold damage and give us 2 ways to crowd control. Remember, in this build, Fierce Strike has crowd control rate, a pretty high crowd control rate. So this is going to allow us to not only bind, which is the lightning crowd control, but freeze as well, which is the cold crowd control. So we are going to be binding and freezing our enemies a lot. So that's also going to give us this damage amplification here, since we're going to be crowd controlling enemies a lot. And then the other thing I want to talk about here is that we have this status effect rate +2 here and +2 here. This is going to increase our rate of crowd control, but it's also going to allow us to debuff. So the debuff for cold is chill, which slows enemies, both their speed, movement, and attack speeds. And it's going to allow us to do the shock debuff. So this is the important one of the two. The shock debuff is going to increase damage by 20% to enemies that are affected. So that +2 and that +2 are essentially 1% chance each for chill and shock. So that's about 2%. And then what I do next is I go into deadly poison and I grab debuff rate and shock rate. So this is like an extra 1.5% between this +2 shock rate and this +1 debuff rate to shock, because we want to make our shocks more consistent. It's that important. That 20% additional damage from shock is huge. So we want to make sure we're doing it. So now when we go look and we start attacking the Scarecrow, you'll see we're shocking, we are chilling, we are freezing and binding. We're doing all 4, and you can see it's actually quite consistent with this build. Now, that was a long explanation for what we were trying to achieve here. So if it's kind of confusing to you, just let me know in the comments. So that is the Zodiac. Now for gear, charms, and avatar information, I won't be going over it in the video. However, I will put all of the information in the description for things like stats you should target on your gear, stats you should target on your charms, and the avatar active and passive skills that you should be getting. Additionally, I will also be telling you which blessings you should go for. That's the build, guys. Really, really big damage. Again, not the greatest for farming, but if you're going for massive damage, this is the one you want. But if you have any questions, or if I haven't been clear on something, drop me a question in the comment and I will get back with you. But what do you guys think? How can we improve this build further? Let me know that as well. I love hearing from you guys. But that's all I got, guys. If the build has been helpful, do me a solid, give me a like and a subscribe. It helps me out a lot. But I've got to get back to the grind, so I'll catch you guys later.